Hi all. Today you'll be seeing me reading a paper that I wrote a couple years ago for a conference, Eastern Great Lakes SBL, essentially Society of Biblical Literature, that focuses on the text of First Maccabees in one sort of motif that gets deployed, namely the motif of family, as a way of legitimating the Hasmonean dynasty in this sort of nascent rebellion that they do against the Seleucid Empire. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give a little bit of historical background into the sort of political situation that occurs. So before you've heard about the Assyrian empires and the Babylonians and the Persians in Hebrew Bible 1, these sort of empires that come in and conquered the northern kingdom first, and then eventually send the southern kingdom into exile as well. Well, at the end of the Persian period, Alexander the Great and his armies marched from Macedon and sort of conquered that whole world again. As some of you might know, Alexander the Great actually dies extremely young for a reader and sort of on the road in his conquests. After he dies, his kingdom is broken up into four separate his empire is broken up into four separate smaller kingdoms. The two that are most important for the text of First Maccabees are the Ptolemies. They are based mainly in Egypt, sort of Alexandria, that area, and they control for a long time the Levant, where Israel is, all the way down through northern Africa, and then the other main kingdom is the Seleucid kings, and they are sort of based in Syria, a little further north, kind of getting towards Turkey, Asia Minor area, and all of that. But the Seleucids and the Ptolemies still have sort of inter-kingdom rivalries, and they're fighting quite a bit over this area where Israel is. At this point, Israel's been reconstituted as a Persian province, Yehud, which is from which we get the words Judea, Judeans, eventually Jews, in some way. So this province is in the middle of these two kingdoms warring over one another. The Seleucids are beset by a lot of external threats during the reign, or during the rebellion of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. And eventually, the Hasmoneans end up winning sort of their independence, relative autonomy from the Seleucid kings. Now, this is important because this is the first time that Israel, or Judah, has had a political sovereignty since the Babylonian exile, since Babylon came and destroyed the temple and razed Jerusalem and sent off the ruling classes into exile. And so one of the dynamics that the text of First Maccabees is trying to deal with is how to legitimate the Hasmonean dynasty, which isn't the Davidic line, how to legitimate that in terms of the traditions that sort of constitute the populace, the population of this region. And so one of the ways that I was exploring in this paper that they do that is by sort of focusing on the family themselves, the brothers of Judas, Simon, all these brothers, all the sons of Mattathias, who win political power but also try to consolidate religious power in the region. Now, in the paper that I'm going to read, it is me reading a paper, and I had recorded some a little bit more updated versions of it, but I was having issues with my video converters, so I've attached after this an old video of me reading the paper. Sorry that it's not a bit more conversational or lecture-like, but I didn't want to stray too far from the main focus of the motif of family in the text. I will also post some of the texts that I'm talking about, particularly excerpted, because First Maccabees is one of the numerous parts of this it's called intertestamental literature. That's sort of a placeholder name. It's not a very good name, but there's not really anything better to call it. But Second Temple literature as well. So this is the period after they've rebuilt the temple under Persian sort of benevolence. And in this time period, lots of changes are going on in the religious and political life of Judeans, of all the provinces in this region. Eventually Rome and Roman military might's going to come and establish dominance in the region. So this is sort of before Rome, but after the Persians are more or less wiped out, pushed very far back into the Asian continent. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope it's somewhat helpful in sort of bringing to light some of the political undertones of a lot of these texts in the Second Temple period. And with that, I will go on to the next video. The text of 1 Maccabees depicts the emergence of the Hasmonean dynasty in the land of Judea within the broader contexts of Seleucid domination of the region and the particular oppression of the Jews at the hands of Antiochus Epiphanes. Though the text is significantly dedicated to following the military victories and political actions of Judas Maccabeus in the revolt against Seleucid imperial rule of Judea, another locus of political authority for the author of 1 Maccabees is the entire family of the Hasmoneans. In particular, the account of the defeat of Joseph and Azariah in their campaign against Yamnia in 555-62 contains an explicit appeal to the familial lineage of the Hasmonean brothers as an explanation for the defeat of the non-Hasmonean Joseph and Azariah. The aim of this paper is to explore the motif of family as an operative political, military, and religious concept in the historiography of 1 Maccabees. Inasmuch as the victory of the Jewish forces against the Hellenistic armies of the Seleucids in both 1 Maccabees and other texts from the Second Temple period convey the participation of Yahweh in the military struggles of the Jewish people, the episode of Joseph and Azariah's defeat would be expected to emphasize the opposite, that is, the non-presence of Yahweh in this military battle. However, the author of 1 Maccabees emphasizes the non-Hasmonean pedigree of those two commanders of the Judean armies as the rationale for their defeat. In light of the narrative of 1 Maccabees, it is my assertion that the author of 1 Maccabees constructs an alternative paradigm through which the deliverance of Israel might be attained that neither does away entirely with the connection between Yahweh's participation and military success of the Jewish people, nor completely reconfigures the locus of military might for the Israelites within the familial boundaries of the Hasmoneans. Instead, the text produces a modification of the traditional pattern of military victory that seeks to incorporate the foundational monotony of Yahweh's strength with the success of Israelite and Jewish victories into the emerging political ascendancy of a particular family in an era of massive geopolitical tension and change. In this sense, the account of 1 Maccabees closely aligns the characters of the Hasmonean family with monumental figures of the canonical biblical texts, while emphasizing the distinct familial lineage that binds the new rulers together. The following paper will proceed through some preliminary reflections on the historical critical analysis of the text and finish with the literary critical reading of the deployment of the family motif by the author of 1 Maccabees. The narrative of 1 Maccabees is thoroughly a propagandistic retelling of the Jewish rebellion against Seleucid rule, with the intention of legitimating the rise and rule of the descendants of Mattathias. In another sense, and despite the apparent ideological character of the narrative, the text of 1 Maccabees offers readers, both ancient and contemporary, a reconceptualization of the mechanisms and institutions that constituted the religio-political economy of the Jews in the Second Temple period. As a basic premise, this previous statement implies a degree of deviation from some other normative religio-political economy in Jewish thinking concerning the interplay between the favor and power of Yahweh and the political and religious institutions comprising the entity of Israel. But that is to say, must the reader of the pro- or anti-Hasmonean texts in the literature of the Second Temple period posit that the Hasmonean dynasty itself and the legitimating historiography that follows is in direct opposition to some other normative image of Jewish sovereignty, either from the history of the Jews before the exile or a contemporary alternative to the mode of governance enacted by the Hasmoneans. From a literary standpoint, the dyad of the traditional and the Hasmonean might prove to be a helpful heuristic construct in analyzing the narrative economy that the author of 1 Maccabees operates within in order to make her case for the authority of the Hasmonean family in particular. The wealth of biblical allusions in the characterizations of Judas and his brothers, and the author's account of the history of the Maccabean revolt, indicate at least an awareness of some other tradition upon which the author may have drawn. The social and political situation that most pertinently frames the narrative of 1 Maccabees is the administration of Antiochus IV and the repression of the particularities of Jewish culture and religion during his reign. The narrator of 1 Maccabees characterizes the oppression as originating in Antiochus's desire for his subjects of his kingdom to be as one people. And in order to accomplish this design, Antiochus outlaws the customs and laws particular to each ethnic or religious body upon the threat of death. The persecution of the Jews in Judea by Antiochus IV occurred in the orbit of multiple international tensions between the Seleucid king and the Ptolemaic dynasty, as well as the looming threat of Roman military might. After multiple partial successes in preemptively crippling any possibility of Ptolemaic reconquest of Seleucid territories, Antiochus IV arrives in Jerusalem and appropriates valuable cultic vessels and adornments from the temple. Upon hearing that Jason and his forces were attempting to recapture Jerusalem from Menelaus' control, Antiochus returns again in a bloody conflict against both Menelaus and Jason's forces, and assuredly a significant number of civilian casualties. This conflict would eventually precipitate the king's decision to permanently station a garrison in the Acra, which remains a point of contention throughout significant portions of 1 Maccabees. Yet all these previous interactions between the Jews in Jerusalem and Antiochus IV pale in comparison to the desolating sacrilege of 167 BCE. As Antiochus erects an idolatrous figure on the altar of the Jerusalem temple, a renewed wave of anti-Jewish policies and practices wash over the region. Altars are constructed throughout the land and sacrifices are offered regularly upon them. The books of the law are torn and burnt, and any family or community found circumcising children are executed. The attack on the religious and cultural traditions of the Jews is portrayed as a wholesale and popular persecution of the Jews at the hands of Antiochus. While the historical reality of Antiochus' program as portrayed in 1 Maccabees ought to be read with a degree of suspicion given the obvious ideological loyalties of the text, Norman Gottwald has noted that one continual characteristic of the centuries of interaction between Israelites, Judeans, and foreign empires is a mutual recognition of the possibility of preservation of Jewish identity within imperial political contexts, as well as the recognition of the possibility of accommodating the particularities of Judahite culture and religion without jeopardizing their rule, their imperial rule, that is. While Gottwald refers in that sentiment to the portrayal of Judah's politics within the canonical biblical literature, he refers to the tenuous situation in the Seleucid era where Antiochus's actions break the tacit accommodation that had been developing throughout the Persian era and apparently had not been fundamentally disturbed under Ptolemaic regime. Gottwald's recognition of the tradition of religious tolerance that seems to pervade much of the exilic or post-exilic canonical biblical literature helps contextualize the author of 1 Maccabees' portrayal of the religious persecution of the Jews by Antiochus as a relatively unprecedented and extremely volatile event in the history of the Jews in Judea. Concerning the accuracy of 1 Maccabees' account of the programs of governance and the persecution of Jews in Judea, it is important to note that the chronology of the events leading up to the Hasmonean revolt contained within the text of 1 Maccabees displays multiple inconsistencies with extra-biblical evidence, as well as the related account in 2 Maccabees. Many scholars have reservations concerning the universal scope of Antiochus's program of religious and cultural homogeneity throughout his kingdom. Peter Green suggests instead that Antiochus' persecution was localized in Judea as part of an effort to eliminate a rebellious local group by abolishing the ideological code that sustained it. Furthermore, the chronology of the 2 accounts in 1 and 2 Maccabees differ on significant points of interest, such as the date of the death of Antiochus, the conquests of Judah, the movements of Lysias throughout Judea. Despite the presence of such historical inaccuracies, or at least historical vagaries in the text of 1 Maccabees, the account recorded in 1 Maccabees must be taken seriously as part of the ideological matrix which forms the author's own rationales for the support of the Maccabean revolt against Seleucid domination, as well as continued allegiance to the Hasmonean dynasty in Judea. For the purposes of this paper specifically, the importance of the initial narrative frame, which includes the author's idiosyncratic version of the events leading up to Mattathias's inaugurating revolutionary act, will be foundational to understanding the perceived tensions and fissures in Jewish political and religious identity, especially as the concept is mediated in 1 Maccabees through the motif of the family of the Hasmoneans. Assuming the importance of the text of 1 Maccabees to the development or maintenance of an ideological base through which the Hasmonean dynasty might combat possible attacks against their rule, it is crucial to come to some resolution on the date of composition for this text. Simultaneously, critical reconstructions of the ancient compositional history of a text such as 1 Maccabees are fraught with uncertainty and imprecision in attempting to firmly place the text within a definitive period of time that is also narrow enough to actually communicate useful information about the context of a text. The apparent lack of any reference to the destruction of the temple by Rome in 70 CE, as well as few, if any, negative connotations about Roman power within the newly forged Hasmonean state, seem to provide the ascension of the Roman Empire in ancient Southwest Asia as a firm terminus ad quem, which just means the latest date possible, for the composition or final redactions of 1 Maccabees. Similarly, a reference in the text to the acts of John and his wars and the brave deeds that he did seems to indicate that the work was completed during or following the reign of John Hyrcanus. A compositional context such as the court of John Hyrcanus reinforces the ideological function of the author of 1 Maccabees' configuration of the political history of the Hasmonean state. Edward de Brouwer argues that the composition of 1 Maccabees may be understood as an outgrowth of Hyrcanus' experience of criticism from the Pharisees. At the time of the early events of the Hasmonean revolt became further removed from the collective memory of the Judeans, sharp criticisms of Hyrcanus' reign elicited a need for a mode of political mobilization and solidification that appealed to the emotional and religious sentiments of Hyrcanus' subjects. Though the general point concerning the nature of literature as a powerful ideological force should be taken into account as it relates to 1 Maccabees, de Brouwer's specification of the compositional context as stemming from the house of the Hasmoneans, in response to criticism from outside of that familial and political group, further emphasizes the function of the circumscription of the military leadership in the text that is closely aligned with the family of the Hasmoneans as part of the Hasmonean process of dynasty building, which always includes some aspect of legitimation of the dynasty in general, as well as the exclusion of rival social, political, or religious centers of power within Judean society. Together with our investigation of the uses of the family motif in 1 Maccabees, it is beneficial to underscore other important theological or political frameworks embedded in 1 Maccabees' portrayal of the emergence of the Hasmonean state. Rainer Kessler describes the Maccabean revolt and its social context as a conservative movement directed against the modernization of society within the framework of Hellenistically influenced ideas. That is, it is sort of a conservative back to our roots movement. In light of this description, one might find the close association of subsequent generations of Hasmonean rulers with the distribution of authority and institutional recognition stemming from the Seleucid kings significantly ironic. And despite the historical development of the emerging Hasmonean state regarding its complicity in the overarching Seleucid organizational apparatus, the description of the Hasmonean revolt in its beginnings centers around traditional Jewish sources of identity and self-definition, in contrast to the designs of the renegades seeking to culturally incorporate the lives of the Judeans within the wider Hellenistic world. For the Maccabean revolt, one integral aspect of this self-definition of the Judean populace is the preservation and protection of the practice of the ancestral laws, traditions, and cult that constitute the religion of the Judeans as inheritors of the covenant which Yahweh made and renewed with the patriarchs of Israel. This emphasis is evident in Mattathias' exclamation after killing the Jew who sought to comply with the royal mandate to offer a profane sacrifice. This is quoting from 1 Maccabees. "All who are zealous for the law and stand firm in the covenant, let them come out after me." In this sense, it is easy to note that the Maccabean revolt is presented by the author of 1 Maccabees as an antipode to the attitudes towards the law and the covenant on the part of other factions in Judean society that were more receptive to the process of Hellenization. The recognition of these ideological centers of the Maccabean revolt are crucial to qualify the following discussion of the emphasis on the familial circumscription of military by the author of 1 Maccabees. Although the tactic taken up by the author in his description of Joseph and Azariah's failure invokes the concept of the Hasmonean family, This emphasis on family is not the only, nor even necessarily the primary ideological resource deployed by either the author of 1 Maccabees in her reconstruction of the history of the movement, or her portrayal of the Hasmonean leadership on the ground in the conflict. For example, Judas's speech on the eve of his battle with Gorgias in 4:7-11 emphasizes the contingent nature of his own leadership in favor of a recognition of the will of heaven as the deciding factor in the possibility of victory against the Seleucid forces. The origin of the authority ascribed to the family of the Hasmoneans in 1 Maccabees is contingent upon the will of the divine, rather than an intrinsic facet of the familial composition of the sons of Mattathias. From this perspective, though, it is interesting to note that the logic employed by Judas in his speech leaves open the possibility of heaven's favor being recognized on a collective entity, which leaves open the possibility, though does not state explicitly, that the Hasmonean leadership might receive heaven's favor for themselves. Specifically in 4:10, he says to his troops, "And now, let us cry to heaven, to see whether he will favor us and remember his covenant with our ancestors, and crush this army before us today." Judas's speech highlights the sources of popular piety and religious consciousness that place the power of Yahweh at the forefront of military successes. But the author of 1 Maccabees presents a secondary mutation of this paradigm through the example of Joseph and Azariah, as he introduces the legitimating motif of family into the discourse of the Hasmonean history that consists of locating this favor of heaven with specific individuals of the Hasmonean. Now that we've set the stage historically and sort of contextually about what's going on in 1 Maccabees, this next section is a reading of how it is that the text itself sort of manifests this familial legitimation and how it characterizes the characters in the text. The author of 1 Maccabees invokes the traditional biblical style of historiography to recount the origins of the Maccabean revolt and the crucial military and diplomatic victories which sustained the rebellious movement. The narrative of chapter 5, then, must be connected to the array of intertextual parallels that pervade the author's description of the valorous acts of Judas and Simon as they set out to combat the hostility towards the newly rededicated and sanctified temple in the aftermath of the desecration at the hands of Antiochus IV. Already one such parallel may be distinguished between the tenuous position of Judas and his revolutionary forces and the community of those returning exiles in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah who found themselves surrounded by hostility to their project of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem and its temple. In this connection, one can see the developing importance of the presentation of Judas and Simon's deeds as a continuation of the characters of the previous heroes of Israelite history. By ascribing to Judas and Simon the position, in this first case, of a contemporary Nehemiah, the author of 1 Maccabees strengthens her case for the preservation of the Hasmonean dynasty vis-a-vis the repetition of the mighty acts of important political and religious figures within the history of the Judean populace. Cattell Berthelot argues in a recent article that 1 Maccabees' account of the numerous campaigns that Judas undertakes against the nations is constructed along the lines of the form of Saul's own conquests of a similar sort in 1 Samuel 10-15. Invoking the concept of canonical assimilation, the author of 1 Maccabees associates the features of several characters known from the previous traditions with the hero he tries to promote by way of accumulation. The general basis of this pattern is apparent throughout the numerous parallels drawn between Judas and 1 Maccabees, with the actions of Saul at the beginning of kingship in ancient Israel. Perhaps the most notable of these parallels is the significant role that Saul's campaign against the Ammonites in 1 Samuel 11 plays in the securing of his kingship and the renewal of his rule at Gilgal. Judas's own rescue mission of his fellow Jews is contained in 1 Maccabees 5:9-54, which also includes a parallel campaign conducted under the leadership of Judas's brother, Simon. For Berthelot, these two campaigns of Saul and Judas served to legitimate Judas as the divinely elected leader of Israel, just as Saul had been in the past. This pattern of canonical assimilation is important as well to understanding the delegitimation of Joseph and Azariah's campaign. While Berthelot demonstrates the relationship of the concept of harem, in 1 Samuel 15 to the encounter between Judas and the sons of Baon in 1 Maccabees 5, 4-5, it seems to me that the concept of harem is also related to the author's own concern to legitimate the authority of the family of the Hasmoneans, at the expense of the delegitimation of spontaneous or non-Hasmonean directed attempts to engage in armed conflict with surrounding nations. And the harem paradigm is the holy war paradigm. We see it in Joshua. It's you probably covered it in Hebrew Bible 1. So just moving on. Berthelot's demonstration of the presence, albeit a muted presence, of the harem paradigm of conquest provides an opportunity to connect another biblical narrative to the conflicts of 1 Maccabees 5, which also tells of an unprecedented defeat of the seemingly invincible Israelites, that of the transgression of Achan and the Israelite defeat at Ai in Joshua 7. Jonathan Goldstein notes the connection between the description of Joshua's deeds and the later deeds of Jonathan after the death of Judas. Notably, the reference to Joshua in Mattathias' speech to his sons in 2:49-70 refers to Joshua as a judge in the land, and Goldstein connects the sudden ascent of Jonathan in the midst of a resurgence of the wicked amongst the Jews with the occasional nature of the biblical judges themselves. Furthermore, the two campaigns of Joshua and Jonathan both follow a similar geographic route from the Transjordan territories eastward and display two monumental crossings of the Jordan River, which caused the authorities of the land to fortify their military infrastructure in preparation for the arrival of the Israelite or Judean forces. With these connections between the conflicts of 1 Maccabees 5 and the narrative of Joshua in mind, the account of Joseph and Azariah's ill-conceived expedition against Yamnia in 1 Maccabees 5, 55-62 may be connected thematically with the narrative of Joshua 7. Both of these texts are situated in their respective narratives as an initial failure of the Israelites, or Judean forces, in battle that will later be overcome after a process of sanctification. For the Israelites in Joshua 7, the sanctification consists of eliminating the things under the ban which have infiltrated and defiled the Israelite camp, perhaps the most significant of which is Achan and his family. But for the case of the Hasmonean campaign against Yamnia, the city of Yamnia is not dealt with again until the later conflict between Sindabeus and the two sons of Simon in chapter 15. So in that sense, the process of sanctification hinges upon the presence of a Hasmonean figure to lead the military expedition. Both of these narratives share a foundational concern for the legitimation of a single mode of divinely sanctioned military activity. This concern with the regimentation of Israelite military activity is apparent throughout the canonical biblical literature, but it remains a vital topic in the messianic apocalypticism of other Jewish texts originating in the Second Temple era. Yet each of these texts displays a mutation of an inherited discourse of legitimation in the service of establishing or maintaining hegemonic control over the polity of their subjects. Whether one investigates the structures of authority propagated by Moses over the wandering Israelites, Joshua's control of the purity of the Israelites as they enter into the Promised Land, Jeremiah's exhortation against the development of a military alliance to secure Israel against the advances of the Babylonian Empire, or the thoroughly overdetermined minutiae of the war scrolls eschatological armies. In the case of the legitimizing discourse in 1 Maccabees, the specifically Hasmonean development to this tradition is the exclusion of Joseph and Azariah on the basis that, quote, they did not belong to the family of those men through whom deliverance was given to Israel. That's 1 Maccabees 5:62. In terms of the narrative flow of 1 Maccabees up to the point of the account of Judas's conflicts with the surrounding nations, the text seems to follow a linear path of the chronology of the rebellion against Antiochus IV and Seleucid governance of the affairs of Judea, beginning with the origins of Antiochus's authority in the region, which is followed by the origins of the resistance movement that emerges from Mattathias' violent response to the idolatrous sacrifice ordered in Modane. After describing these origins, the author of 1 Maccabees turns to the history of the Hasmonean state vis-a-vis the conflicts between Judas and Antiochus. The author of 1 Maccabees follows these encounters between Judas and the Seleucid representatives throughout the large narrative block of 3:1 through 9:22. But chapter 5 presents the reader with a sudden interruption in the author's retelling of the Hasmonean family's resistance and victory against the imperial power of the Seleucids. This interruption does not appear to be the consequence of a haphazard redaction. Instead, John Bartlett notes that the references to the sanctification of the temple in 5:1 through 2 and Idumea in 5:3 connect this pericope to the preceding narratives. But the overall narrative's connection between the death of Antiochus IV in 6:1 through 17 and the process of Judas's fortification and purification of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is clearly interrupted by this particular narrative of Judas's conflicts with the surrounding nations. Chapter 5 presents the efforts of Judas, Jonathan, and Simon to rescue their kindred from the danger posed by the surrounding ethne along the lines of biblical traditions of the preservation of fellow countrymen and women, epitomized in the character of Saul, and of the journey to and conquest of the land demonstrated by the figures of Moses and Joshua. Furthermore, the recognition that the author of 1 Maccabees interrupts his own narrative at this point in the text may be strengthened by noting that all of these battles are undated. While much ink has been spilled to reconcile the seemingly disparate dating of important events in the narratives of both 1 and 2 Maccabees, as well as the possibility of reconciling the two possible seasonal inaugurations of the year in the Seleucid calendar, within the text of 1 Maccabees itself, the author displays an interest in contextualizing the events of the narrative within some historical chronology. The most salient example of the author's use of a tangible historical dating is the reversal of the desecration of the temple by Antiochus in Judas's recapture and sanctification of that temple, and this is from the text, a year later, at the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles profaned it. So we see that the author is very concerned with, even though the timeline may be wrong in some sense, we would say, they're very concerned with locating most of what happens in 1 Maccabees in some sort of timeline. Chapter 5, however, does not receive that same sort of tangible historical location of the battles. Bartlett proposes that the interruption of chapter 5 in the overarching narrative might be better understood in light of the similar literary phenomenon in chapter 8, an account of a diplomatic interaction between Judas and the Romans. Both the narrative blocks of 5:1 through 68 and 8:1 through 32 would have been difficult to integrate into the basic narrative, and thus the author seeks to incorporate these independent blocks of narrative at the high points of Jewish success. This placement of these obtrusive pericopes at the pinnacle of the early successes of Judas and his brothers may offer the author of 1 Maccabees an exceptionally suitable moment in which she may serve as her own interpreter. That is to say, in light of the preceding narrative, the interruption of that narrative signals the possibility of self-interpretation and the positing of an ideologically dense pericope as a signifier of the meaning of the story as it has progressed thus far. So in what capacity is the motif of family deployed in chapter 5 by the author of 1 Maccabees? An initial tension is set up in place when Judas commissions Joseph and Azariah as the two who will be responsible for remaining with the remnant of the army not chosen by Simon nor Judas. However, their charge of the military is conditioned by Judas to only use force in the service of self-defense. Furthermore, Judas's words in the text seem to point to the possibility of imminent military action for the body of troops under Joseph and Azariah's command, but only upon the return of the Hasmonean brother to Judea. At this point in the narrative, the author has already constructed the presence of the Hasmoneans themselves as an integral condition for the proper functioning of the military forces. Judas is both raised above the non-Hasmonean leadership of Joseph and Azariah through his role as the source of their positions of authority, and he is the temporary limitation of their function in these new positions until Judas and his brothers may return to supervise or carry out those functions themselves. The characters of Joseph and Azariah are only mentioned 3 times in the entirety of 1 Maccabees, and all 3 of these explicit mentions are contained in chapter 5. They appear only together, and there's no explicit mention of their death in the text. While the pairing of these two figures might arouse suspicion about their function for the author as straw men over which the glory of the Hasmoneans may be projected, the text itself offers little in further characterization of these two figures, and the text does not seem to overtly attack the men on any other basis. The only significant biographical information concerning Joseph and Azariah are the two epithets used to describe the men in 5:18. Joseph is given a non-Hasmonean lineage as a son of Zechariah, and Azariah is described as a chief of the people. While Azariah's description fits well with the incorporation or commissioning of non-Hasmonean officers in the rebel military, which was also extended in the early stages of the rebellion to the ranks of the Hasidians, aligning with Judas and his brothers, and we'll come back to them in a minute. The description of Joseph stands out as unique in its familial association, as well as the lack of any explicit military qualifications. The focus of chapter 5 leaves Joseph and Azariah behind as quickly as they emerged into the narrative and does not pick up their story again until 5:56. In the intervening material, Judas and Jonathan, as well as Simon, set out against the nations surrounding Judea, win decisive victories against the designs of their enemies, and plan to bring these endangered Jews back within the protection of the newly forged Hasmonean authority. In the time that intervenes between the victories of the Hasmoneans and their return to Judea, the narrative turns to Joseph and Azariah, who hear of the valiant deeds that the brothers have accomplished. This term appears again in 1 Maccabees to designate the total collection of the deeds of Judas in 922, as well as those of John Hyrcanus in 1623. In response to the deeds of the then absent brothers, Joseph and Azariah exhort themselves to likewise make a name for ourselves by engaging in conflict with the surrounding enemies. In undertaking this task, Joseph and Azariah obviously transgressed the command of Judas that accompanied their ascent into their positions of authority. The account of their defeat is swift and simple, taking up a mere 3 verses from the charge of the troops until the narrator's recounting of the losses suffered that day, as if the battle was proceeding as more of a matter-of-fact operation than a narration of the possibility of 2 men's accomplishment of some valiant deed. At this point, one may see vestiges of the traditional paradigm of Yahweh's blessing upon a battle from the Hebrew Bible. Any trace of transgression on the part of Joseph and Azariah in the motivations leading them to battle would alert the reader to the numerous parallels within biblical traditions concerning the proper execution of military activity. As Berthelot has argued that 1 Maccabees 5 follows closely the biblical example of Saul's conquest to rescue his countrymen and women, and the subsequent confirmation of his kingship, one should also remember the transgression that leads to Saul's deposition from his royal throne. The transgression of the command to wholly eradicate the Amalekites, including their king. Yet the author of 1 Maccabees does not explicitly frame the transgression of Joseph and Azariah as a transgression of purity laws or the fulfillment of a harem-style commandment. Instead, the transgression is identified as their failure to adhere to the commandment of Judas and his brothers. Their violation is not to be found in the transgression of God-given restrictions of battle, but in that regimentation announced by the Hasmonean family. The text has up to this point referred the Hasmonean family through circumlocations, or referring to the entire family by name on an individual basis, referring to them as either the sons of Mattathias or the present formula of Judas and his brothers. But in a secondary comment on the reasons for Joseph and Azariah's defeat, the text drastically expands the family metaphor to include the more explicit term, the seed of those men. The author connects the failure of Joseph and Azariah with the simple fact that those 2 men were not from the correct lineage. But the author does not refer to the Hasmonean house explicitly, nor perhaps more accurately, by its dynastic name. The text instead connects the notion of the family of the Hasmoneans with a particular action. This is from the text. But these ones were not from the seed of those men through whom deliverance was given to Israel by their hand. And that's 1 Maccabees 5:62. Thus the text suddenly introduces the motif of the family of the Hasmoneans as both the lineage that may produce the individuals who will carry out the mighty deeds needed to protect their kindred, and the historical entity that has thus far delivered Israel from the aggressions of its enemies. The form of the term used to refer to the Hasmonean family, seed of those men, is only used one other time in 1 Maccabees in reference to the fracturing of the Hasmonean-Hasidian alliance, whose formation was narrated in 1 Maccabees 2. In contrast to the deployment of the family motif as it pertains to the specific group of the sons of Mattathias and their descendants, the author of 1 Maccabees recounts another forceful use of an appeal to lineage, to familial lineage, that differs from the religio-political aspirations of the Hasmonean family as communicated through the text. The Hasidians are said to part ways with the rebel movement upon recognizing Alcimus, who is described as a priest of the seed of Aaron. They recognize Alcimus as a legitimate alternative to the concentration of power in the hands of the family of the Hasmoneans, who are, in contrast to Alcimus, not members of that revered Aaronide lineage. They're instead members of a smaller country priest lineage. The influx of support offered to the Hasmonean rebellion from the Hasidians in 242 is surely thought of by the author of 1 Maccabees as a critical lifeline to the nascent rebellion. The incorporation of this block of the Judean populace, who are described by the authors as mighty warriors of Israel, into the revolutionary forces of the Maccabean revolt was a short-lived alliance that, though productive in terms of establishing strategic footholds, was ultimately overcome by another appeal to a significant historical and religious lineage embodied in the figure of Alcimus. The fracture of the Hasmonean-Hasidian alliance is produced on the grounds that Alcimus's appointment as high priest is a legitimate restoration of the previously interrupted possession of the office of the high priest by a priest who is able to trace his lineage back to those of high priestly stock, namely Aaronide lineage. Goldstein, a commentator I referenced before, asks a seemingly rhetorical question of the Hasidians who naively trust Alcimus' promise of benevolence. Goldstein says, after their bitter experiences with the Hellenizing high priest Menelaus, how could the Hasidians have such trust in the mere fact of priestly descent? It is apparent enough that the author of 1 Maccabees thinks the Hasidians' obeisance toward Alcimus is misguided, given the latter's quick execution of a number of Hasidians. However, Goldstein's phrasing of Alcimus's claim to priestly lineage as a mere fact misses the significant weight with which this identification plays in the economy of legitimation present in the text of 1 Maccabees. The author of 1 Maccabees' inclusion of the Hasidians' motivation in affirming Alcimus as potential friend of traditional Jewish religion offers the reader two competing lineages, that of Alcimus and the high priesthood, in contrast to the newly forged dynasty of the Hasmoneans and their claims to political and religious authority. Not only does the author include alternative conceptions of the importance of a particular family lineage that might differ from her own religious and political loyalties, but this aspect of the text demonstrates that the currency of familial legitimation was an important piece of any claim to religious or political authority in the chaotic situation of social and institutional upheaval that characterizes the history of Southwest Asia since the Macedonian ascension to power in the land. Inasmuch as the Hasmonean propagandist of 1 Maccabees is able to enlist the family unit of the sons of Mattathias in the maintenance of Hasmonean claims to authority, so too may other factions of Judean society invoke their own preferential familial claims to authority and critique erroneous manifestations of those same types of appeals to the lineage of a particular familial group. Though much of the previous discussion has centered on the figures of Joseph and Azariah in the text of 1 Maccabees, one must also note the curious repetition of the case of Joseph and Azariah merely a few verses later in the chapter with a group of priests who also seek to accomplish a valiant deed. While information is scarce concerning this priest, the author of 1 Maccabees immediately connects the two accounts through consistent reference to the valiant deeds which they sought to accomplish. As perhaps expected, these priests fall in battle, but no explanation is given for their defeat. A firm identification of these priests as a subtle reference in the text to the priestly critique that later Hasmoneans would suffer as the two offices of the kingship and the high priest were condensed into a single individual ruler from the Hasmonean household, would be impossible on the basis of this text. However, the connection between the reign of John Hyrcanus and the production of 1 Maccabees offers an interesting paradigm through which one might interpret both this reference to the priests and that of Joseph and Azariah's defeat as a defense of the legitimacy of the Hasmonean dynasty. Questions of lineage and the problem of legitimation are central in the radically changing and undetermined political landscape of the Second Temple period. Alice Hunt, approaching the issue of the development and importance of a Zadokite lineage in this same period, summarizes the issue that the author of 1 Maccabees confronts through the deployment of the motif of the Hasmonean family. Given the dissipation of the previous era's relatively mundane imperial occupation, the Second Temple period's politico-religious landscape, and the most recent example of Menelaus's purchase of the office of the high priest, destabilizes the traditional paradigms of legitimization that must then be reconfigured and deployed by those who wish to achieve a legitimate power in the region. As Hunt suggests, the issue of legitimation grows in importance during the Second Temple period and is of paramount importance to the later Hasmonean rulers such as John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, and Alexander Jannaeus. Mirroring the creation of a Zadokite lineage through the manipulation of historiography, the author of 1 Maccabees can be seen to perform a similar act of loyalty to her patrons, the Hasmoneans. Whether through the assimilation of certain canonical figures of military might to Judas, the demonstration of alternative yet inferior familial lineages at work among other social or religious groups of the Judean populace, or the condensation of the gradual victory that the Hasmoneans won from the hands of the Seleucid kings, the author of 1 Maccabees constructs the history of the Maccabean revolt in such a way that no other lineage might be able to challenge their claim to the production of the deliverance of Israel from the violence and oppression of the Seleucid Empire epitomized by Antiochus IV. Joseph and Azariah, as well as their priestly counterparts, surely intended to support the Maccabean rebellion in their actions, but in the context of the imperial pressures exerted on the fledgling Hasmonean kingdom, and the intra-Judean struggles for the institutional power of the high priesthood in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE, the author of 1 Maccabees must make it explicitly clear that there is no deliverance for Israel except as it comes from the hands of the Hasmoneans. Thanks.